So let's begin with a few introductions. Who are you going to hear from today? We're going from left to right. We're going to hear from Dr. Dane Anderton, who is Program Director on our Leadership and Management Development Programs. Then you're going to hear from Alec Waterworth, Dr. Alec Waterworth, who's one of our lecturers in Project Management. We're going to hear from Liz Wiggett, who's in our Sales and Marketing team. She's going to be handling your questions. And finally, me, I'm responsible for recruitment and enrollment on the open programs. So just a quick reminder, not all of you will have joined us last time for the first of the series, which was called Success Doesn't Happen by Accident. And that we looked at leadership, strategy, and innovation. And I'm just sharing a couple of tools that we provided free for use. We'll be doing the same thing again during this webinar. So you should finish this webinar with a few free tools that you can take away and use straight away. Now, if you didn't see the last webinar and you'd like to, please email me. My email address will appear at the very end, and I can send you a link to the previous recording. So what are we going to cover today? Well, it's really only 4 things. We're going to cover, first of all, a little bit of context around getting things done and why it's important to leaders and managers. Then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Alec Waterworth, who's going to talk about project management and talk you through some of the theories and, more importantly, the practical tools that you can use. Then we're going to hand on to Dane Anderton, who's the program director, and he's going to talk about how project management fits into our wider program of leadership and management development. And as I've said at the end, there'll be an opportunity to ask your questions. So please feel free to ask away. We will collate them and Liz will go through them with us at the very end. So let's begin. A little bit of context, getting things done. Why is that important to leaders and managers? Well, put very simply, managers and leaders are very often tasked with moving from one position to another. And this is what we mean when we look at projects. We're not talking about everyday work, just doing your day job. What we're talking about here are special events. It could be relocating an office. It could be introducing a new performance management system. It could be launching and developing a new product. It could be introducing an IT system. Very often, a leader or a manager will be required to get people, processes, and things from point A to point B. Very often our expectation of that is it should be a wonderfully simple, nice, linear process with each action leading naturally into the next. But I don't know about you, but in my experience, sometimes it's anything but linear. The reality is obviously a lot more messy, usually a lot more messy. And why is this important for leaders and managers? Well, it's because very often leaders and managers are the ones who are required to navigate this complexity, find a way through all of this mess and get people, things, and process from point A to point B. So let's just take a quick look at maybe some of the different roles that a manager or leader is expected to perform during a project. So I'll give you a second, just have a quick look at the screen there. You can see lots of different roles. Maybe some of them you're familiar with, maybe some of them are new to you. But very often, if you're involved in managing or indeed leading a project, you might find that you have to flip from salesperson to spokesperson, from project planner to problem solver, or even from role model to referee. There's no one role that is the only role required for project management. It does require a unique skill set, spread across quite a lot of different skills. And I like this as a little bit of a visual metaphor. Modern managers now, you're expected to be all things to all people. You're expected to have lots of different skills. So I like the metaphor of the Swiss Army knife because a manager is expected nowadays to be able to take out the right tool for the right situation. And more importantly, know what the right tool is for that situation. So how do you start to build up those different tools? Well, luckily, you can come and work with a business school. And in most of our programs, we believe in the fundamentals of leadership and management. So they form part of almost every program that we run. Now, some people use these as opposites. Leadership is about people, management is about process, and never the twain should meet. But we believe actually modern leaders and managers need to be both, need to be able to do both. So what I'm going to do is pick out a few themes from our programs to sort of show you what I mean. So looking at leadership, most of our programs start really with leading yourself. The whole point is if you're going to be able to lead other people, you need to have an understanding of what it's like to be on the receiving end of you. What are you like as a leader? Only then can you start looking at leading teams and leading talent. Putting the other side to that, management side, we also look at three other themes: finance, strategy innovation, and project management. And those really complement the first two. So in the first two, you start to know how to manage yourself and how to manage others. In the next three, you learn how to understand the numbers, know what numbers you should be looking at. You start to unpick making strategic choices and understanding about innovation and making the right choices so that your project fits within the overall strategy. And finally, we put everything together in project management because that really is about getting things done. But not just getting things done. Very often, a project delivery is about getting it done to spec, on time, and on budget. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is the motto of the Alliance Manchester Business School: original thinking applied. What do we mean by that? We value the research, we value the theory, we value the tools. But what's really important to us is helping you put them to use. So what you'll hear in any of our programs is a lot about how do you make this stick at work? How do you use it? So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over controls to my colleague, Dr. Alec Waterworth, and he's going to take you through some of those tools, some of the application for running a project.
Great, thanks very much, Kieran. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're good. We can hear you,
Brilliant.
Alec.
Okay. Right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you for your interest in the session and in the program. I'm Dr. Alec Waterworth. I'm a lecturer in project and program management at AMBS. I'm part of the executive education faculty, and what that means is, quite simply, I don't teach undergraduates or postgraduate students. I work entirely, 100% of my time is with working with people such as yourselves who are in full-time employment. To tell you a little bit about my background, at least in terms of my experience in terms of projects. So prior to starting my academic career, I worked in the oil and gas industry. So I worked on a couple of very large multi-billion-dollar projects. So up in Aberdeen for BP in the development of a new oil rig, and over in Brisbane, Australia for Shell on a huge natural gas project that will actually span about 30 years in total. Having said that, everything we're covering today and everything we cover on MLDP is applicable and helpful in terms of getting the job done. So that's the reason we've titled this today, Getting the Job Done. Project management at the heart of it. It doesn't matter if you're project manager, it doesn't matter if you even work on projects. The stuff that we cover here, the skill set, the mindset, it's all very helpful in terms of helping you get the job done. Okay, and this is what we're going to cover today. So first of all, taking a look at why projects succeed or fail. We'll then take a look at the project lifecycle as a whole, which feeds in very neatly to one of the key things I want to leave you with, which is this idea of left shift and why we left shift. And we'll also take a look at risk management as one of the key ways in which projects I see time and time again do not adequately plan for, and to try and leave you with a practical tool that you can take away with you today to try and help you in managing risk going ahead in your work. So you might be asking yourselves, why does this matter? Particularly if you're not a project manager or you're not working on a project. Well, there's a few reasons really. So for one thing, as I've already touched upon, project management is broadly applicable across many sectors. And one thing it does very well is it defines a plan that can organize chaos. So I'm sure in all of your work day to day, there is complexity, there's risk, there's uncertainty. What project management does, if applied effectively, is it builds a plan and a set of processes that help us manage all these things that our working lives can throw up. Another thing about it that's very important is that it enforces and encourages teamwork. So a lot of the outputs around project management are incredibly valuable, of course. So we develop risk management plan, for example. That's fantastic. That's very important going forward. Having said that, the process itself is actually very important. So in the process of delivering on project management, we get other people involved, and in doing so, we give them a sense of ownership around the work and the role that they have on that project. We benefit from their different experience and expertise. We start to establish lines of communication and build trust within our teams. So whilst the output of project management is really important, there's actually something about it that really helps to encourage and enforce teamwork within a project environment as well. A huge amount of research has shown us that it reduces risks, that it cuts costs, and that it improves success rates on projects if applied effectively. Another crucial element of it is that it ensures that we learn from failure and from success. So projects hold a lot of benefits beyond the financial benefits for an organization, and one of which is quite simply that they're a source of organizational learning. So what we can do is ensure that we feed up all the lessons learned that we continue to take on board as we proceed through the project, and then apply them to future projects going forward. In just the same way, during that project process, we can draw in the lessons learned from other projects and make sure that we benefit from the knowledge that the organization already holds. There's another couple of benefits I'll mention quickly. So quite simply, anything involving changes a project. As I've said, if you don't work in an area that's deemed project management, this stuff can still be very, very helpful to you. An example of this is that during my day on MLDP, I will ask you to come in your groups, if you have an idea that you want to pitch for your group to work on throughout the day, and we simulate the project life cycle during the day, you can pitch for it. And we get a lot of ideas of things from the workplace, like a new marketing program or an expansion of the premises. But we also get a lot of ideas like converting camper vans and home renovations and things like this that people will work on in their groups. So if we think broadly, anything involving change as a project, and I'm sure your organization, and probably more so now than you've ever seen before, is nothing if not generating change. The other final point I'll make is that the skills and the knowledge that you'll pick up on any project management program will be very much valued by your employers, and increasingly so. So I'd like to, just before we move on to the theme of project success and failure, it would be great to hear from you folks in terms of where you've seen areas of failure crop up and why you think that might have occurred. So we've got a quick poll here that Kieran will put up on the screen. There's 8 options. I'm sure you've seen them all before in the past, but what I would like is if you can please give me your top 3. We've got a lot of people in attendance this morning, so it'd be really interesting from such a large group to try and understand where you have found the 3 areas in which you've found most problematic on the projects on which you've worked.
Okay, thanks, Alec. We're gonna have a few minutes while people kind of vote. Okay, so just a couple more seconds. We've got about half the people have voted. If you don't want to vote, That's okay, but I would get in there fairly quick. I'm going to give maybe another 10 or so seconds, just because everybody's got an opinion on this. And then we will share the results of the polling with you. And again, this will be available after the webinar.
Kieran, can you hear me, Kieran?
Yes.
Some people might not know where the poll icon is. I only noticed it by hovering over the screen. So some people might not be voting because they haven't seen the poll icon.
That's a very good point. Thank you for that. So yeah, the answer to that is it's in the should be in the toolbar where you've got your mute, you've got your stop video and polls. There's a little 3-bar chart there. So hopefully everyone can find that. If you don't, please by all means type in your response in the chat area. Okay, so I think we're going to hold it there. So I'm going to end polling. That's about 85% of people polled. So let's have a look at the results. So by the looks of it, overwhelmingly, what would you say there, Alec? I'm saying poor communication is the number one.
Yeah.
But equally, unrealistic deadlines, poor planning come in second and third, very close. So I think that's probably fairly representative of what we said earlier, where project planning is that combination of both leadership skills and management skills. It's people and process. So in some of the other sessions we'll be talking more about the communication side in terms of people. But I'll hand back to Alec now to continue with the webinar.
Thanks, Kieran. If you move us on to the next slide, please. That has set up things very neatly, actually, in terms of what I'm going to talk about. So this is a way to conceptualize the project management environment. So this is the project management triangle. And what we have here in the center is quality. Now, this is quality in terms of the broadest sense of the word. So every project has a set of requirements. Quality here is quite simply the extent to which the outcome of our project meets those requirements. So that's basically how, at the heart of it, we're going to judge success and failure, how well we have met the requirements of our customer. Around that, there are a set of constraints. We have 3 constraints here, but this is by no means exhaustive. There's other considerations such as safety and human resources and many others that could be in consideration here. But we have cost, scope, and time. The requirements that we have, of course, have to be balanced against the constraints against which we are operating. At the same time, these constraints have a relationship between themselves. So if we were to add a few bells and whistles to our project, product or service, the outcome, you can imagine what that will do to cost and time. If we were to reduce our budget, you can understand, of course, what this might do to scope and to time. So we have to understand both the nature of these constraints in terms of a relationship with the requirements, but also the relationship that exists between these constraints. The other point to make here is that a project is only as good as the requirements that it gathers. It needs to make sure that these are clear and accurate, that they are well understood, and that they are communicated, because they're very much the building blocks upon which a project is built on thereafter. You can imagine if we do a fantastic job of taking our requirements and then building those up into a design and a plan that is executed perfectly. If we've missed a couple of requirements right at those early stages, we're ultimately building a solution that is never going to fully satisfy what the customer wants. And that's why we have requirements in the center here. Okay, Kieran, if you can please move us on. Thank you. And this is an example of 5 ways in which projects fail. And this list has come from the APM, which is the Association for Project Management. This list is by no means exhaustive, but it's helpful here in terms of illustrating the key point I wish to make. If I take each in turn quickly, poor communication, of course, came up on the poll. I'm not surprised to see it see it there really as the top answer. It's really job one when it comes to a project manager. Nothing a project manager does is more important than how they communicate. And that's communication in the most formal to the most informal terms. And it's not just outgoing communication, it's also the way in which a project manager listens and processes the information that they're taking on board. It's the way in which they are a supporter of teamwork, and way in which they set an example for communication on a project. So that's why that's so important. That's why that's on this list here. Messed up requirements, which is not a technical term, but it's very much what I've already described. Everything is built on these requirements. So we really have to make sure that these are clearly documented, because if we don't do that, we're going to set ourselves up for failure. We're never going to satisfy requirements if they're unclear, if they can be misunderstood, misinterpreted. Impossible expectations. I'm sure you've seen some of this yourselves in the past. Quite often we can inherit projects. In fact, MLDP has existed for a long time, and Dana's inherited this as a project. And there may be expectations when we adopt projects, when we're handed projects that aren't realistic. This is one reason why it's so important to engage with stakeholders, to try and understand where those expectations have come from. And when they're not realistic, we need to bring them into line with reality. Another reason to engage with stakeholders is to understand where we are in terms of funding. Too often projects proceed into more costly stages of development before they're ready, before funding has been attained. So we need a healthy, consistent dialogue with stakeholders to try and understand where we are in terms of funding. In a similar regard, misappropriated resources. So this could be budget, this could be human resources. In terms of the latter, I saw a lot of this, certainly when I was working for BP. At the time, there was an oil and gas boom, and there were a huge number of projects gearing up. And quite often, people were being dropped into our project team, but also leaving our project team to go and pursue other ventures for the company. The problem with that is it makes it very difficult, of course, to plan if you don't know who is going to be on board. There's also something around team chemistry and lines of communication and trust that is lost and is quite difficult to recover from. It takes some time. When we drop someone in, they are bringing in a different set of ways of working and different areas of expertise, and that takes a while to recover from, and can also shake customer confidence in our ability to deliver. So these are 5 examples, and these are 5 examples that I imagine would probably become most problematic later on in the project. But I think what's most interesting here is that actually these are things that can be best addressed during the earlier stages of the project, during the planning phase. I'm going to talk about left shift as a principle in a few moments. But what's important to take away from this is that if we look at each of these examples, we can plan for communication. We can build a robust methodology around gathering requirements and engaging our stakeholders. We can build budgets and cost breakdown structures around funding and budgeting, and we can build organizational breakdown structures and clear responsibilities, and we can build estimates around reality to really make sure we're heading off on the right foot, and in order to basically make sure that we avoid failure and increase our chances of success. So if we take a look at the next slide around project lifecycle, I'm sure many of you have seen a project lifecycle before. And this is one set of terminology from the PMI. The APM has a different set of terminology again, and you'll also see different variations where we have 5, 6, maybe 7 stages, but what's important to note with all of those is that those extra stages can always be mapped against a model such as this. What's important here is that every project has a beginning, middle, and end, and this is roughly the stages against which a project proceeds. There's also what are termed stage gates in between these stages, typically, where there's a set of criteria that have to be met before a project can proceed from one stage into the next. To take you through each of the stages quickly in turn, the initiation stage, this is fairly unstructured. We've identified a problem or an opportunity, and we then work up a business case with a recommended set of solutions, and one solution in particular, typically. And we've explored the feasibility of those different options in order to make a recommendation. If we've done everything right in initiation, I'll come to what a strong initiation looks like. We then proceed into planning. So here we start to work that solution up into a project plan. We start to scope individual activities and tasks and determine the resources and the time we're going to need in order to deliver those tasks. We work up a project plan. We start to build a budget. We identify risks and establish lines of communication and ways of communicating with our stakeholders. And we've added considerations such as quality management to the mix, of course, as well. If we've got our project planning right, we then proceed into execution, and that's quite simply where we put that plan into action. So here we are going through a process of continuous monitoring against the plan and the reality. And when we identify that we are not keeping up with the plan, we are enacting corrective actions to make the best possible efforts to bring us back into line with the plan. Finally, a stage that is quite often forgotten about, but one I've already touched upon, is closing. Now, part of project closing, of course, is to hand over the final output of the project to our customer to deliver all the documentation and support they might need in operating that product or to consume that service, to close out supplier contracts and to end contractor contracts. But a really key part of this is capturing the lessons learned, as I spoke about before, to make sure that the organization is learning from our experiences, from our successes and our failures on our project. It's here that I'll introduce this concept of left shift. So this came about from a paper by Merrow that studied 21,000 projects to try and understand where is the most important, where are the most pivotal activities in a project. And what they found was, without question, what is done and not done in the planning stage is the most important. Far too many activities are left till later down the line when things get very costly and changes are far harder to enact. And that's why we strive to left shift. Okay, I've worked with several companies and this is a very, very big part of their mindset and has been really transformative in terms of how they manage projects. It adds a significant degree of cost predictability, of schedule predictability. It improves the overall quality of the final product and the safety and operability of that final product. So quite simply, it is the most important mindset you can take into a project, is to try and eliminate change in the later stages by making sure that we do the best practical project planning right up at the front. The next slide shows you an indication of why we do this. So in these early stages of a project, this is really where we have the greatest influence on the project outcome, but at the same time, it's where costs come quite easily and quite cheaply. So in these early stages, there's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of options still open to us. Some decisions might have been made, but even those are quite cheap to change up. Later on, spending has increased significantly, decisions have been made, actions have been put into place. There's a lot more people involved, and changes are generally harder to put into place. And even a small change in these later stages can have a huge knock-on effect. So that's why we are trying to eliminate change early on. This is why we left Shift. The next slide tells a similar story. This too is based on a great deal of research and shows the difference between a poor project definition, project planning, and a strong project planning period. You've got 4 scenarios here. The difference between A and B is how well we did in execution. So is the difference between C and D. The only difference here is how well we do in execution. The real distinction here is between B and C, which is defined by how well we deliver on project planning. You can see in these really early stages where a problem has been identified and we're trying to understand the requirements of that customer and translate that into a scope of work. You can see this knock-on effect as we continue to suffer from what's often termed a quality gap, and it stays with a project throughout its life and often grows exponentially and is very, very hard to recover from. So that's why we left Shift. In terms of how to do it in practice, on the next slide, this is what it looks like in practice. And these are quite simply a set of questions that I would encourage you to ask and to examine. If you're the person who is project owner, you need to make sure that you've answered these questions. If you're the person making the decision whether to green light a project, you need to be asking these questions. So in project initiation, quite simply, is the business case robust? And you need to be looking for 2 things in particular here, 2 very simple questions, but very important questions. So the first of all is, can we do it? So given the resources we have available to us, and also the projects that we currently have in action and prospective projects we have on the back burner, is this a worthwhile venture? Is this something we can feasibly achieve? The other question we need to ask is, should we do it? So given all the risks and given the costs, and they should be based on sound figures, the risks and the costs, as well as the anticipated benefits, those 2 need to be realistic. Is this a worthwhile venture for this organization at this time? In the planning stage, if the answer to all of those is yes, in the planning stage, quite simply, we need a project plan that is executable, where nothing has been left till later on. Because once we leave planning and we enter execute, it's going to be extremely difficult, as I've shown, to enact change. So that we need to make sure that we have, to the best of our ability, eliminated change. So we need to question whether the scope of work is complete. We've covered every facet of every activity, and it's assigned and it's costed and it's got a realistic time frame, and ultimately that the project is executable. I'll move us on to a discussion of risk management now, which is one element of project planning but often gets left too late in the process. And this is one area where I would encourage you to left shift, to build this into your left shift mindset. I'll point you towards this paper by Klein. This is free to access through Harvard Business Review. It's based on some very strong research, and it's very accessible. It tells you in a lot more detail than I have time to go into today, how to run a pre-mortem. Now, when I was working in industry, I used to be part of risk management, risk identification committees. And these are difficult meetings to run. It's difficult to get a lot of energy in the room around, especially over 2 or 3 days, around thinking up all the different ways in which things might go wrong with the project. What pre-mortem does so well, and I really wish this was a tool that I was aware of and was available to me during my time in the industry, is it adopts a hypothetical position of things have already gone wrong. So that's why this term prospective hindsight is here. We're examining what did go wrong. We're projecting things forward days, weeks, months, years, and considering all the ways in which things might go wrong. We're not starting with the root cause, as is typically the case with risk management exercises. We're actually starting with the effect, and then we're starting to work back. And I've seen this work in several different contexts very, very well. The research tells us that this will increase our chances of identifying future events, so future risks and opportunities, by 30%. And the point here is to do things early, to build this into our planning early on, and use the risks that we identify to further strengthen our planning, to try and get us up to that point where we have an executable plan that is trying to eliminate change. So the final slide I have for you is around how to do this in practice. So this is simply the outline for a session that I run on MLDP, which gives you a little snapshot of how this actually works in practice. But I think this is something that you could take away into your workplace. If you're aware of the possibility that there may be underlying risks that you haven't identified as yet, then I would encourage you to work in teams to really strive to give this a go, because it's been hugely impressive to me ever since I built it into my teaching. So the first thing you do is you start out by considering all the ways in which your project has failed in the future days, weeks, months, years. And then in turn, and again, this really benefits from a team and a diverse team in terms of experience and expertise. You present each failure in turn as if it has happened, and it is on the rest of the group to cross-examine you. So you're working backwards here. You're working backwards from the failure to try and identify the root cause. And it's on the people in your team to ask really important questions like, of course, what caused this around every failure, but also why didn't we see this coming, which is another very big question. And in the process, you will find that you continue to uncover more risks as you go along. From that point, you need to consider for each risk, and you have an example here in terms of a risk register, two things: the likelihood they are to occur, and also the consequence were they to occur. And from that basis, you can then start to prioritize certain risks. You have a clear score in terms of a scale in terms of which you need to pay the most attention to. And from there, you can assign actions for their management. So you might take an action in order to avoid the risk altogether, to try and mitigate its impact. You might wish to pass it on somehow, perhaps by taking out additional insurance. You might simply accept that this is a risk that you can live with. So those are a couple of things I wanted to leave you with. Left shift is perhaps more of a mindset, but I've still hopefully provide you with some guidance of what that looks like in practice. And then the pre-mortem in terms of a tool, I think can be tremendously helpful. I hope that's been useful. So thanks for your attention, and I'll happily take any questions at the end of the session.
Okay, thank you, Alec. Let's just take a moment to hand over to Dane Anderton, our Program Director.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you very much, Alec, as well, for going over a kind of a snapshot of the project management full day as part of the Manchester Leadership Development Programme. You might have heard MLDP mentioned a few times. So I don't want to dwell too much on this, and apologies for those who maybe joined us last time and have joined us again today. There is a different slide in here, I do promise. So if you can just move on, Kieran, onto the next slide. I think what Alec has gone through there is project management and how fundamental leadership is inside that project management phase and leading that change as well. So again, coming back to this topic of leadership is a skill set that all firms across all sectors is going to need to survive. And I think that is becoming much more pertinent now as we move into recovery. And also, I think there's a lot of talk of transformation, how our business is going to transform, not just recover after this pandemic, but also transform business practices and transform the way in which we do work. So again, leadership's going to be key to that. So just move on, Kieran. So for us, around our leadership development programs, and again, we have a number of these, and today I'm more or less concentrating on the Manchester Leadership Development Program. It is about this acceleration. So you may have come into a job, into a management or leadership position very recently. You may be looking for an update in your knowledge. These programs are about accelerating that strategic thinking, developing new capabilities for yourself, but also we're not just focusing here on challenges. And yes, there are a lot of challenges at the moment with COVID-19, but there's also opportunity in this. There's opportunity, and I see many small businesses, whether it be the local chippy, whether it be the market stall holder, who are now kind of becoming more resilient as businesses because they're having they're having to think differently about how they get their product or services to the customer. So it's not just about that. It's about looking at your organisation now and in the future. And again, that recovery word is now turning into more of a transformation word. So let's not just think about how we come out of this, or how businesses over time recover from, whether it be financial crises or whatever that might be, but how you transform after it as well. And this is what we're trying to get across today. Go on to the next slide. And just looking at some of the evidence base that is around here, you'll see a citation at the bottom of this slide. Now, some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware, we have an industrial strategy in the UK. And there's been kind of a decade's worth of data collected to go in and to inform the industrial strategy, which was launched in 2017. And those of you in Greater Manchester will also know Greater Manchester has a local industrial strategy. And that's where leadership and management has been highlighted several times, time and time again, back in 2012, again in 2016, and again in a more recent report around degree apprenticeships as well. Productivity is driven by good practices in leadership and management in organisations. It's part of the puzzle. I'm not saying it's the only piece, but it is part of the puzzle. And one of the statistics we can draw out of these reports, again, which have informed the UK's industrial strategy and Greater Manchester's, and I assume other places such as the Yorkshire area as well, and Scotland and Wales, best practice management development can increase organizational performance, and what is banded around here is around 23%. Okay, so that's nearly on a 5-day week equivalent to a full day's productivity. So if we can just move on a moment, Kieran. So the Manchester Leadership Development Programme is something that we run here at Manchester. What is it focusing on? And again, this is kind of a golden thread through many of our programmes. We start with leadership, you. So looking at your leadership style, your leadership characteristics through a psychometric analysis called the Hogan psychometric. The second session is about the team. So once you've understood yourself and you understand, this is what my motives and values are, how does that factor into leading the team, and how can you manage a team effectively and lead that team effectively? Finances as well. So we're not saying you need to be an accountant. We just need to give you the skill set, the tools, the language to have those conversations around finance, so you can get on with your colleagues, you can understand budgets. Strategy and innovation together. Again, thinking about how we drive these projects, or how we drive change for the long term, how we capture value for the organisation, whether that's just for third sector organisations thinking about value differently. So it might be more about societal value, or if you're a public sector organisation, it's about those residents maybe, or patients who use your service. But why do we put project management at the end? Because it relies on these prior 4 sessions, how we lead, how we understand our team, how we might manage a budget, and how we think how this is going to have long-term impact, and how we might bring about innovation through that project. Move forward, Kieran. Don't want to go through all of these in much detail because you'll get a copy of the slides, but picking out the key points here. These are our program level learning outcomes. Looking at number 5 there, and Alec has touched on some of these already today, understanding how to define, design, implement a project. But that project is dependent on understanding your personal leadership, understanding leaders' influences on their team, understanding financial management, applying your strategic decision making to develop and understand innovative capabilities. Again, all 5 core functions we see as part of any leadership program at Manchester. How do we deliver this? Just to quickly say the different types of format that we have. We do have intensive programs, 5 full days, but also we have flexible programs whereby you will complete it one day, say every other week. So it can take around 9 weeks to complete this particular program in what we are speaking about today. And just to give you an idea, we have 5 core units that you will do, and there are the post-it notes giving the titles of those units. But that's just the kind of theory and the initiation of practice, let's call it. But we do have a fuller program which can take between 4 to 6 months, where you can say, I want the theory, I want the practice, but I want the application as well. I want to be able to take that away, go into my organisation and demonstrate some impact. And that's where we have the ILM award by October, and also executive coaching. So we're not just saying we're focusing on your knowledge and improving that knowledge, we're focusing on the skill, actually going away and doing, but also then looking at your behavior as well. So the executive coaching is about that mindset and changing the mindset for you. So again, you can either have the core units on their own, or we do a full suite for you where we look at the application as well. And just some quick tips. So how this program, how do we make it stick? Some quick tips, thinking about our 5 days, the leadership in practice, finance managers, project management. Some quick one-liners that I asked the course conveners, the facilitators, to kind of say, what's your day in just a few words. And, leadership in practice is about reassuring your team. I think reassurance during this period is absolutely fundamental. We hear a lot about that. We hear a lot of this from local authorities and from government. Well, I'll leave you to make your own mind up there, but reassurance is key. Leadership has got to give reassurance during these times. That's to your team, to ensure maybe that there is going to be business afterwards, or we are fighting for that business. You let them know about the plans that are happening. But equally, leading your teams, looking at the talent, empower them, create a sense of community within that. Many of us are working remotely, or we're now working with social distancing. That is causing kind of forced separation for us. Empower your team. Create that sense of community through Zoom meetings, through any virtual means. Finance for managers, forecast your cash flow. That is going to be essential now. Making sure that your cash flow is going to be there, making sure we can understand it and have the language to understand it as managers and leaders, not just leaving it for someone in another room, somewhere else in the organisation. Strategy, innovation. This resonates everywhere. Keep it simple. The more confusing or the more complex your strategy or your way out of this, the more likely it is to get confusing and then blurry and then lost. Project management, only control what you can. So I think Alec came back to a number of times in there, projects can sometimes get too big. The brief you're given can be too big. Think about what you can control. Think about, again, that risk register. Think about how we do that pre-mortem. Get everything that you can and control only what you can. Thank you very much for that. I think that was my last slide in there, and I'll hand back over to Kieran for any questions. I'm happy to take questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Dane. So we've got a few minutes left before we're actually at time, and I can see in the chat area that there's been a few questions filtering in. So I'm going to call on my colleague Liz. Liz, are you there? Can you collate or maybe suggest a few questions that we can address through the panel?
There's been a bit through, but it's mainly from Paul Hamlin. There's been a few Pauls, but Paul Hamlin sort of went through a bit. It was all to do with Alec and the left shift. So I think there was a couple there. There was one that was, do you think this is because people want to take action? I think this was when Alec started to talking about the left shift and how things change. They want to move to delivery before the planning is formally closed out. So he touched on that. And then he also talked about what about ensuring that we stick to the scope and be firm about this once it's underway. And people do want to change and add, especially if it is going well. So I don't know whether Alec can pick up on that.
Yeah, those sound really good ones there. So we've got sort of, do people want to have a propensity to go to action first and need to spend more time in the planning phase, and also scope creep?
Yeah.
How do you stop people from getting off the scope? Alec?
Great. Yeah, very good question. Not one with an easy answer, but I can speak about what I've experienced, and also what some of our clients in exec ed have sort of flagged as key areas for focus in terms of some of our project management programs. So one of the reasons, I suppose, is that a left shift mindset hasn't been put in place, which ultimately means that planning doesn't have to be complete by the end of planning. We can leave some things to execute. That's deeply problematic. So I think one thing is to get that message across that we are going to be ready to execute by the end of planning. And then looking further back still, by the end of initiate, we are not going to get out of initiation until we have a robust business case, until we've clearly answered those two questions. I think also that some organizations have what could be termed soft stage gates, where we have a set of criteria, but if we quite like a project, sometimes we will just let it slide through, and it'll be a case of, well, just make sure you pick up those things. I've worked in I've worked for two companies where it was very much hard stage gates, and it needs to be in oil and gas projects. It absolutely needs to be, because of the stakes that are there in play. And I think I can speak about one issue in particular that I've seen in practice. I saw during my project at BP, but is also, again, a big point for clients of ours, which is optimism bias. So a lot of projects almost exist in a bit of an ecosystem where there's a self-perpetuating sense of positivity. Now, that's very good in terms of teamwork, but what it can lead to is you taking your eye off the ball, thinking you're further along than you have. With something like the funding issue that I suggested, that's an example of optimism bias. We're sure that the client's got the funding in place, but actually we haven't taken the time to check. So I would suggest keeping an eye on optimism bias and your stage gate process, like making sure that you put into practice the left shift principle that I've suggested here, making sure you're not proceeding before you're ready. In terms of sticking to scope, it's a difficult one. There's normally processes in place in terms of design for a lot of projects. So deviations from design is normally a formalized process. In terms of how the work is done and when the work is done, that's often when the eye is taken off the ball. If you've done the planning right, you're going to have a lot of useful resources against which to measure the reality. So you've got your various plans and you've got the reality. So it's then a matter of making sure that you're enacting a process of continuous monitoring, that you have assigned responsibilities to carry out that monitoring, and to then make sure that the outputs of that monitoring process is actually enacted. So we are taking corrective action. We are communicating to the people in the team. We're bringing in the stakeholders when we need to, and also that we're reporting on it regularly. I hope that answers that question.
Real. I've got, just to let you know, guys, there's quite a few questions coming in, and we are sort of getting to that 11 o'clock stage. I'm thinking if we perhaps take one more question, and then maybe the team can pick up with everybody later and pick up these other questions, because I think we're going to take a while to get through them all now. So another question is from Bob Fram, and I think this was quite a good one. And he said, I would like to hear how to make sure lessons are learned, as in my experience, once we have a project closing down, basically everybody's looking to go on to that next one, and how we sort of keep them focused, you know, basically to the end is a good one.
Yeah, No, that's a great question. I was fortunate to work for companies where this is really part of the ethos. So I would run into problems as someone relatively early on in their career, and I could get onto a lessons learned database with either of the companies that I worked for, and actually pick up the phone and talk to a guy even in Houston or the other side of the world to really get more detail around that issue. I think it's about establishing a system organization wide so that you're capturing those lessons, and the fact that you haven't done that to date is okay, but make sure that there's an effective system from day one for capturing those. In terms of a project, it needs to be part of the team ethos to draw from the expertise in the wider organization, but also to make sure that they're constantly contributing to it. So that's part of utilizing that system, but it needs to be part of this sense of teamwork. It needs to be part of the communication planning. It can even be a metric against which performance is measured. I've seen that be very effective before as well. In terms of project closing, you're quite right, Bob. And project closing is often rushed because we want to get on to the next thing. It's a matter of scheduling and making sure that we are putting the time aside for that, and that we are keeping resources in place until the job is closed out. Now, actually, the sharing of lessons learned, if we've done our job, they can be gathered and shared throughout the project process. That doesn't need to be only unpacked at the end of the project, but actually both sides are important to that puzzle in terms of feeding that up into a wider organization. We want to gather them as we go, but we also want to make sure that we're having a full debrief at the end of the project as well.
Okay, Alec, thank you for that. And unfortunately, we are at time. As Liz mentioned, we'll be taking some notes of some of the questions that we couldn't cover today and endeavour to get back to you individually. As we've said, this has been recorded, so will be available after this webinar. If you want more information on either the webinar or the programme, please do feel free to email me. My email address is there at the top of the screen. On behalf of Alliance Manchester Business School, I'd just like to thank you for joining us this morning, and stay safe, and I hope you have a very pleasant day.